Ladies and gentlemen, the presentation is starting. Michael, please go ahead.
Thank you, George, and welcome everyone to today's eSeminar event, a crash course in PCI Compliance. And today's event is brought to us by CDW and McAfee. I'd like to thank them for that before we get going. This is Michael Krieger, and even though the PCI Data Security Standard has been around for years, it's still poorly understood by many of the organizations it affects. It's a complex topic. There are lots of different documents, a maze of acronyms, and plenty of vendors pitching just a wide array of different services. So what is the PCI DSS? How does it work? How do you approach compliance? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we get going, today's webcast is completely interactive and incorporates many social networking tools. You can tweet or directly post information to social media sites, including blogging platforms, bookmarking sites, social news sites, social networking sites, all right from the console. Just scroll along the bottom of the screen and click on the Share This widget. Also, if you have a question for one of our speakers, please hit the Ask a Question button on your console. We'll get to your question during the event. Or during the live Q&A at the end. We'll answer as many as possible, and ones we don't have time for, we'll get a written response via email after the event. You can also use the green Resources widget to download a copy of the slides. We have some other assets in there for you as well. Every window you currently see, from the slide window to the Q&A window, can be enlarged or collapsed, so if you want to change the look and feel of your console, just go right ahead. And finally, when we're done, we'd appreciate if you completed our post-eSeminar survey to let us know how you like this event. It helps us make future events more compelling for you in the future, and you'll see the link when the event completes in the lower right-hand side of the screen. Well, joining us today is Peyton Engel. He's a technical architect with CDW. We've got about an hour to go, and we've got a lot of information to cover, so I'm just going to turn it over to Peyton to get things going. Peyton, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Peyton, as has been announced, and here's what I hope we can get through today. A little bit of history and background. I want to kind of paint for you the picture of how we got where we are. Talk a little bit about who has to comply and how come, so basically who's on the hook for PCI compliance, and then a plan for how to approach compliance. And I think this is probably the most valuable part, or at least this is if you take nothing away, these are the three things that I want to get through. Most importantly, scope, the attestation materials that you'll have to submit, and sort of the idea of gap analysis. And then we'll spend a little time on common pitfalls, whether it's with the way people go about the project or whether it's with specific technical issues, and then talk about what kind of help is available, etc. So there is the plan at a high level. And why should you listen to me? So who is this guy anyway? So there's me. I'm a little more gray these days than that picture suggests, but I am the head of CDW's security assessment team. We've got a team in place. It's been in continuous operation since 1998. I've been on it since 1998, and we do testing of customer environments, networks, applications, systems, etc. for security weaknesses, and we do compliance consulting and fun stuff like that. So PCI is right in our wheelhouse. I should mention that I am an attorney, but I am not your attorney. Nothing in this presentation constitutes legal advice. If you rely on it in court to your detriment, that's your problem, not mine, etc., etc. So there's a brief introduction to me. Very fascinating, I am sure. Let's get on to the real meat of things here. The first thing that I want to get to is the concept of the card brands. And I'm going to introduce a lot of different terms in the course of this, and I apologize for that. That's one of the bad things about PCI, is it's just replete with acronyms and jargon. I will have a slide near the end that's kind of a quick reference for you later when you're trying to talk about this stuff with other people, or when you're on the phone with somebody who's telling you about PCI. This is maybe a little guideline for you. But I'll kind of try to lay them out as we go along. So the first concept is the idea of the card brands, and these are just what you might think. And I've listed them kind of in descending order of influence. Visa is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Its 400-pound orangutan cousin is MasterCard, and then we go down the line, Discover, Amex Discover, Diners Club, etc. These are the card brands. They're the, when you get a payment card or a debit card or a stored value card, it's their logo that's on it. So a few years ago, they each got tired of these massive security breaches where someone would grab a huge pile of their payment card numbers and make off with them. So payment cards, when you make a purchase with your payment card, the payment card brand gets some small cut, right? They get a percentage of every purchase that you make. And they've built into that some expectation that there will be fraud. You might go to a restaurant, pay with your Visa. On the way back to your table, the waiter writes down your Visa number and goes home and buys something on Amazon. A certain amount of low-level fraud, they've built into their business model and they're ready to accept it. But what they hate is when somebody makes off with a few thousand or a few 100,000 card numbers at a time. That is a big problem. And so they got sick of this and they said, we've got to do something about it. And they started implementing security requirements for their business partners, and these were largely banks. So MasterCard had something called Site Data Protection, or SDP. Visa had something called CISP, Cardholder Information Security Program. You don't need to remember these. These are obsolete acronyms. They don't really exist anymore. But the point of the story is that in the olden days, if you were dealing with multiple different card brands, you might have multiple different security requirements that you had to deal with, one for each card brand, and this is confusing and annoying and expensive and all kinds of other bad things. And so the idea arose of, let's unify this. And how are we going to do that? Well, the card brands got together and they said, let's form a brand neutral body, the PCI Security Standards Council. Now, the Standards Council is known to its friends sometimes as the PCI SSC or the SSC or the Council. Whenever you hear those things, what they mean is this body that is put together and sponsored by the various card brands. And it's technically a corporation. It's a small corporation. And the purpose of it was to unify these security requirements so that anyone who was dealing with payment card numbers could have a clear and sort of distinct statement of what they were supposed to do and how they were supposed to get it done. That's the idea of the PCI SSC. And it does basically three things. The main thing that it does, the most important thing, is it publishes some standards. And the one that we're going to talk about most today is the PCI Data Security Standard, or PCI DSS. And that's coming up. We'll see much more about that as we go along. But there are a couple of other standards. There's one if you develop payment applications. There's something called the PA DSS, or Payment Application Data Security Standard. So the PCI SSC publishes standards. That's probably its most important activity. The second most important thing it does is it manages the certification database for various different assessors. So we'll come back to this, but at certain points in the PCI lifecycle, you might need to have work done by somebody who holds a bona fide PCI credential, like approved scanning vendor or qualified security assessor, or if you're unlucky, PCI forensic investigator. And the PCI SSC manages the accreditation process for those various people. So if you need to look up, is somebody a legitimate provider of this or that service, the PCI SSC, that's who can tell you. So they publish standards, they manage those sort of certification databases, and then the third thing that they do is try to kind of organize the community. There's a little bit, they're trying to build some synergy here where major stakeholders like large banks or very large merchants, people who are strongly affected by PCI compliance, they try to kind of get them together for conferences, to form working groups to deal with difficult topics and things like that. So that's really the point of the PCI Security Standards Council. What's interesting, if you were to actually go there, it's very small. I don't even think there are 10 people there. It's a very small organization. It's essentially a virtual company. And it gets input from the card brands and it solicits input from the community. But really what it is just sort of this shell organization that the card brands stood up so that they could all have one unified banner to march under when it came to security. All right, so that's what the PCI Security Standards Council is. fun and fascinating. So one of the things that I said they did, the most important thing, was publish the PCI Data Security Standard. And this is when people talk about PCI compliance, what that means is you do the things in the PCI Data Security Standard. That's what you're trying to comply with. So this also is known by various titles, the PCI DSS. Sometimes you just hear the DSS. And then sometimes when people just say PCI, we need to comply with PCI, what they really mean is comply with the PCI Data Security Standard. So that's this document, basically. That's what it is. And it does a few different things. It defines some terms for us, and we'll talk about one of those terms, the most important being the cardholder data environment. So it defines terms. It gives some guidance as to how to work through the compliance process, and it gives you some examples of how to fill out certain control worksheets, etc. But the bulk of the document, about 50 pages of something like a 60 or 65-page document, is devoted to a set of security controls. And a control, basically, in this context, just means a security measure that you're supposed to have in place. So you have to have antivirus, you have to have a firewall, you have to have intrusion detection, that kind of thing. So these controls are organized into 6 major areas. Those 6 major areas sort of span out into 12 requirements. Each of those requirements has many sort of sub-objectives. So it's about 50 pages just of objectives. It looks like a giant spreadsheet for the most part. And for each objective, reading left to right, you get a statement of what's required. And I see I've cleverly spelled required there, require med. You'll have to just take me at my word that what I meant was required. There's a spurious ME in there. And so it's got a label, a statement of what you're supposed to do, and a testing procedure. So how do you know that the person did this? And that's kind of what the DSS looks like. And it's published, as I said, by the PCI Security Standards Council. They are the one true source of all information about this. And we're currently on version 2.0, which came out in 2010. We're expecting a new revision late this year. That there will be a 3.0. And there were very few revisions from the prior version to version 2.0. We're expecting, nothing too major. It won't be a cataclysmic change to 3.0. There will be some changes. We don't know for sure what they are yet, but it doesn't look like there's going to be any major shakeup. And so what this document does, it specifies these different controls, but the most important and interesting thing about it is that it focuses on the protection of what's called the cardholder data environment. So when you look at other security standards, like say HIPAA if you're in healthcare, or FISMA if you're dealing with federal government information, they are very broad in terms of what they cover. They talk about maybe the whole organization. The PCI Data Security Standard is very clever. It is focused, laser-like focus, on protecting payment card data. It really doesn't care about anything else. And there's a good side and a bad side to that, and we'll get back to it. But it's really important to bear in mind that if whatever you're talking about in your environment, if it isn't part of the cardholder data environment, probably don't have to worry about it with respect to PCI. And we'll see how that theme kind of recurs throughout the remainder of the presentation. So another thing to note about this is, like all documents, the PCI DSS is imperfect. It is open to some interpretation. And so you'll see people who get in arguments or conflicts about this. And you see from time to time specific points get resolved one way or another depending on the customer's environment. And that's just sort of the way of the world, unfortunately. Or, for better or worse, I guess. It works out well for some people. So you've got this document. It tells you a bunch of stuff that you're supposed to do to protect your cardholder data environment, and some of it has a little wiggle room to it. All right, so on to the next thing. Let's look at this in more detail. I said that there were 6 areas and 12 major rules. Let's see how those are organized. So the first area is called build and maintain a secure network. And this is basically, have a firewall. Don't use default passwords. Most of the PCI DSS, it turns out, is pretty much common sense. None of it is really avant-garde security thinking. But these are the first two requirements, and they seem simple enough, right? Most of us have firewalls, and most of us have changed default passwords, or at least have thought about it. There's kind of a lot of attention to detail, defining what it means to install and maintain a firewall, what kind of firewall, what kinds of things you need to do, what counts as maintaining it. When we talk about changing vendor-supplied defaults, what things need to be changed, how do you have to manage that changing process, et cetera. So there's a lot of detail that fleshes that out. But at a high level, the big ideas are pretty sensible. Next one is protect cardholder data. And here we have a requirement both to protect it when it's stored, and that generally means encrypting it or not storing it at all if you can avoid it. And then when it's in transit, making sure that it's encrypted so that people sniffing the wire also can't get to it. So that's the second major area, requirements 3 and 4. The third major area is maintain a vulnerability management program. And what this means is have in place a plan for protecting against vulnerabilities over time. Don't just think of vulnerabilities as a snapshot in time. So don't just have antivirus, but keep it up to date. And if you're developing systems or applications for use in the payment card environment, the cardholder data environment, you have to think about security throughout the development process and then throughout the life cycle of those products as you're using them. Next, strong access control. This area has 3 bullet points under it, so 7, 8, and 9. So restrict access, basically this is the need to know principle. People who don't need access to payment card data should not have access to payment card data. We need unique IDs so we can tell who is accessing the payment card data. So don't have just a generic sales ID, right? Every salesperson has to have their own ID when they're accessing cardholder data so that we can tie a given instance of access to an individual, and then restrict physical access as well. So if you've got paper copies of payment cards, don't leave them lying around out in the open. Put a lock on your data center door, that kind of thing. Again, not exactly rocket surgery, but these are the requirements. The next area, monitor and test to make sure things are working the way you think. So tracking, it should say track and monitor access. Another typo by me, I apologize. Not tack and monitor access, but track. And then test security systems and processes. Oh my goodness, I have run amok here at the keyboard. So test, not rest security systems.
That happens, Peyton, when you're making these presentations in the middle of the night.
Yeah, the more people you're planning on presenting to, the more likely it is you're going to make an idiotic typo.
And these are all attendees on their toes.
These are all really good ones too, because the spell checker won't catch them. So, all right. So anyway, the idea here being that under this 5th of the 6 areas, we're going to keep track of what's going on. We're going to test our security to make sure it's doing for us what we think it's doing, and we're going to track incidents as they happen and so forth. And then the last area happens to have just one thing under it, so I don't see why we have its own separate area and it's its own rule, but we do, and that is just have a policy that addresses information security. So this is basically, here's how you dispose of a piece of cardholder data when you're done with it. Here's what you have to do, the standards for safely handling cardholder data. So these are the major areas under the PCI DSS, and that's how they shake out, basically. And like I said, none of this probably comes as a major surprise. Most of it looks pretty reasonable. If you were to read the fine print, you'd find that there's an exceptional amount of it, but there's nothing here that catches us off guard or strikes us as, wow, that's really weird. But this leaves us with a question, right? And so here's my questioning guy. First off, so what? Right? So these cardholder brands, they came up with a data security standard. So what? I don't owe them anything. They don't have any power over me. Most merchants don't have a direct relationship with Visa, right? They're dealing with their bank. And most, your e-commerce, you're going through some payment gateway. You're not talking to MasterCard. So what if these guys thought up some security standard? That's nice of them, but what do I care? Next question. So I don't do any business with these folks or the PCI Security Standards Council, right? Not only do I not do business with MasterCard or Visa or Discover or Amex, I don't do any business at all with the PCI Security Standards Council, so why does what they say have any influence on my life? And then lastly, it's not like this is a law, right? Do they really have any power to tell us what to do, right? This is just a document written by some small corporation. How does it come to haunt me? Why do I have to worry about it? Well, I got bad news. Here's how it really becomes your problem. It works not by law, but by contract. So what happens is basically the card brands said to the banks, hey, banks, Chase or Wells Fargo or Bank of America or whoever, you're not going to be able to issue our cards anymore unless you become PCI compliant. So we started with the big banks, right, because they're the biggest risks, so the big national banks, and then they're kind of trickling down to smaller banks. But the basic thesis is, hey, bank, you can't issue payment cards anymore. No more visas in your name, no more, Citibank visas, unless you guys become PCI compliant. So the banks say, well, that's a huge piece of business for us. Our customers like having our Visa. They like having their ATM cards. So we better become PCI compliant. And then the banks think, well, wait a second. We put in all of this work to become PCI compliant, but really we weren't the ones leaking information in the first place. Hey, merchants, we're not going to process your payments anymore unless you're PCI compliant. And again, they started with the big merchants, so Targets, Walmarts, Sears, that kind of folks, and then it trickles down. They kind of prioritize things based on volume of transactions or size of the merchant. But the basic thesis here, just like it was with the banks, hey, we're not going to process your payments unless you become PCI compliant. Okay, say the merchants, we better get on that. So the end result is if you accept or handle payment card data in the course of your business, you are going to have to comply. Maybe you already have gotten a note about this, and maybe you've already gone through it a couple of cycles. But some people haven't yet. Some people are still thinking, hey, it hasn't really happened to me yet. Maybe I can skate by. So not everybody has gotten a letter from their bank or from their payment processor or whoever it is, but they will. So if you haven't yet, you might as well take the initiative and get working on it. Because it really will come. You'll lose the ability to do this kind of business if you don't get on it. So I seem not to be able to advance the slide. Let's try that. All right. So is compliance the same for everybody? We saw that there's one PCI DSS, right? So there's one, stone tablet with the commandments carved in it. Surely that's the same for everybody, right? Well, kind of. The PCI DSS is the same no matter who you are. So if when you look at any given objective in the PCI DSS, any one of those specific commandments, that's going to be the same for everyone. So nobody kind of gets off the hook based on who they are for any given objective. But the volume of business that you do and what you do with payment cards can make a difference. So basically what I'm saying here is not all organizations have to address all objectives. So the first question is volume of business. And the big distinction here is whether or not you would be required to engage a firm that has a certification called QSA, Qualified Security Assessor. So do you have to have an official third-party audit? So a little background on that. One of the requirements of the PCI DSS, of course, is that you submit some paperwork saying that you're compliant. Some people can submit what's called a self-assessment questionnaire, and others have to have what's called an official report on compliance, or ROC. And a report on compliance can only be completed by a firm that holds a certification called Qualified Security Assessor. Generally speaking, sort of numerically, very few firms actually have to have a QSA. The really big merchants have to. So if it's a household name, yeah, they probably have to. And then some others do too. If you've had security incidents in your past, or if your bank is just mean to you or something like that, they might tell you you have to get a QSA to do this for you. But by far, the vast majority of organizations don't have to do this. And the deciding factor, what determines whether you have to use a QSA or not is the volume of business that you do. So generally speaking, only very large merchants have to do that. And then the second question is the nature of business that you do. So we just said you either have to get a ROC or you have to fill out a self-assessment questionnaire, which they call a SAC. But there are different self-assessment questionnaires. And which one you need to complete depends on what you do with payment card data. So the big question is, first off, do you store payment card data? If you do, you have to fill out, generally speaking, you have to fill out SAQ-D. D is the hard one. You don't want to fill out D. So this is this is a secret message to you. If you can get out of storing payment card data, you get to have an easier time with compliance. The next question would be, do you just have little phone terminals where you swipe a card and it dials out on a phone line? If that's all you've got for payment card stuff, your life just got a lot easier. It gets even easier if you outsource all cardholder data functions. So let's say you're an online merchant, but when somebody actually goes to check out from your shopping cart, when they make their payment, that goes through PayPal or something like that. If you outsource all cardholder data functions so you're not ever touching a payment card number yourself, your life just got even easier. It's a very short form you have to fill out. You still have to fill it out because you are a merchant who is taking payment via payment card, but because you don't ever actually touch the data itself, you don't have much to do. So we have two questions there. How much business do you do? And the answer is, unless it's very, very much, you get to fill out a self-assessment questionnaire. And then the second set of questions is, what are you doing with that cardholder data? How are you using it? And that will determine which SAQ you have to fill out. So compliance is not really the same for everybody. The DSS is the same, but not everybody has to do all parts of it. All right, so how do we know what we need to do, right? That's the next logical question. Where are we headed from here? First question, what is the bank telling us to do? And when are they telling us to do it? There's really no getting around this. You could try arguing with your bank, but it generally doesn't work. So if they tell you in a letter you have to use a QSA, well, by golly, you're probably going to have to use a QSA. And if they tell you you have to do it by this date, that date probably carries some weight. So the second question is, what are you going to have to provide to the bank to prove that you are compliant? And generally speaking, it is two things, either a ROC or a SAC, and then quarterly scans of your external IP addresses that show that you are compliant. We'll get back to that. So the third question is, what is in scope? What do we have to do all of those PCI objectives to? And here again is this idea of the cardholder data environment. The things that you have to worry about are any systems that store or process or transmit cardholder data, even just a little bit. So even if you just store a number for 5 seconds and then ship it off to some batch payment place, you stored it. Okay, and so that the systems where it got stored are in scope. Things that if the cardholder data passed through a switch on its way to the firewall or something like that, that switch is in scope. So you think about systems that are in scope. It's anything that stores, processes, or transmits cardholder data, or is directly connected to things that store, process, or transmit payment card data. And so what generally happens is people look at the PCI DSS and they look at their environment and they look back at the PCI DSS and they look back at their environment and they say, holy cow, if we got to do all of this stuff, we are either going to go broke or crazy. And that is because they have missed the secret message here, which is the PCI DSS only applies to the cardholder data environment. And so what this is telling you is figure out what systems absolutely have to be involved in storing and processing and transmitting payment card data and carve them off from the rest of their network. Put them in their own little secure enclave, and then you only have to worry about those systems. You don't have to do PCI compliance across your whole environment, and that's a hugely helpful fact. All right, so next question. Okay, so we figured out what's in scope. What would we have to do to answer in the affirmative to all of the objectives? So in our SAQ, you can think of the SAQ as basically a bunch of questions you have to answer yes to. So what do we have to do to get to the point where we can, with a straight face, check yes in this box? So that seems simple enough, right? It's basically a 4-step process, and really step 1 is a no-brainer. So that seems simple enough, but there are some wrinkles to it. The first thing, and I will emphasize this several times, scope is king. Maintaining or controlling what's in scope and making that as small and as simple as you possibly can, that is how you win at PCI. So again, the PCI DSS applies to the cardholder data environment. And let me just reiterate, it applies to the cardholder data environment. So, it takes people a while for this to sink in usually. But the message here is make your cardholder data environment small, simple, separate from the rest of your environment, and you win. It gets easier. So how do we make this simpler? Shrink and isolate the cardholder data environment. If it seems like I'm a broken record, it's because this is the single biggest thing you can do, the biggest favor you can do for yourself in a PCI compliance effort. And it kind of makes sense, right? It stands to reason because it's easier to secure something small and simple than something big and complicated, right? That stands to reason. And in some cases, you might be able to get rid of your cardholder data environment altogether, and then you're moving to that model where you've outsourced all your cardholder functions, and you get to fill out just a little SAQA, and it's just like 10 questions, and it's easy as pie. So that's rare. Not everybody can do that. But if you're working with PCI, always be thinking about how to pull things out of scope. Anytime you can do that, that's a direct economic win for you. It's one less license of this or that tool that you have to buy. It's one less thing you got to keep track of. And that's just a direct win. So anytime you can pull something out of the cardholder data environment, that's a good thing. So if you take nothing else away from this presentation, think about this. Controlling scope is the biggest deal for you. All right.
Let me just jump in for 1 second here, Peyton,
yeah.
and remind everyone in attendance that they can submit their questions at any time. We have a bunch in the queue already, by the way. But we can't get to yours if you don't send it to us. So go ahead and send your questions in. Go ahead.
All right. So how are we going to structure a project to get this done? Here's my advice. First off, one problem that people often face is the PCI DSS looks like a bunch of IT stuff, and so it gets dropped on IT's desk. The business says, hey, IT, go make us PCI compliance. IT can't do this alone, right? The business has to help because they know what goes on with payment cards, and they know what changes they can make or they can tolerate to business processes. IT can only move IT levers, and so if IT is solely in charge of the PCI compliance effort, you'll get this kind of convoluted solution where you've built a crazy fence around a very unevenly shaped object where maybe if we just made a few simple changes to a business process, things might have gotten a lot easier. So first thing is involve the business. Don't think of this as an IT problem. IT is going to get to do most of it, to be sure, but it's not just IT, and IT shouldn't be in it alone. The second thing is figure out what materials you're going to need to provide. So generally speaking, this is going to mean which SAQ, and the way to figure that out is to go to the PCI Security Standards website. There's a link there for merchants, and there's a link on the For Merchants page that helps you determine which SAQ. It gives you a series of questions to figure out which SAQ is right for you. And then the next thing, the sort of next thing that you're going to have to supply is the quarterly external scans. My advice is leave the scanning to the end. That's the easy part. Focus on scope and the hard parts of the PCI DSS first. So you're going to next clearly define scope, right? Make it as small as you can. Keep in mind that making a change to a business process might be a huge savings. So, for example, if you have currently a website where people can make payments, and you have a form where they can type in their payment card number, and then you send the data from that form off to PayPal, that's totally different from having a form, having a website where you're selling things, and the form that people type in their payment card data into is hosted over at PayPal. The one puts a lot of responsibility on you. The other puts a lot of responsibility on PayPal. And if I were me, I'd rather have it be on PayPal. Or, for example, suppose you had a group of people who are in an office pool, and sometimes, most of your selling gets done by by purchase order, but if it's a new customer and they don't have credit yet, you'll take a payment by payment card. And so you have 5 or 6 people who take orders during the day, and so they all want to type in payment card data once in a while, not very often, but once a day or something. What you could do is maybe just set up a single terminal on its own little internet connection. Get a cable modem or a DSL line or whatever for this thing. Set it up on its own totally separate network, and when someone needs to do a payment card transaction, they go to that thing, and that's all it's used for. You've suddenly that's your whole scope for PCI. That's a huge win for you. So see if you can't look for ways by changing a business process, would that give you an ability to really shrink scope? That's something to keep in mind. And then the next thing is, once you've figured out what's in scope, go through the objectives that you have to worry about on your SAQ, look at the audit process in the DSS, and figure out, hey, do you have what it requires there? And if you don't, what are you going to do about it? So make a plan to close those gaps. So anytime you see a no or a I'm not sure or anything like that as you're filling that out, figure out what you're going to do about that. And that's really the main plan. Again, the scanning and testing stuff, save that till you're ready to go. That's generally the easy part. The hard part is engineering the processes that are going to contain scope and keep the network running over time. All right, so how are we going to do that gap analysis? So my recommendation is get a couple of people together, an IT person, a business person, maybe a couple of others who would be interested. Get pizza and some high caffeine soft drink or something like that, and just do a quick pass through. Don't spend more than 1 or 2 hours on this, and just group for the objectives you have to worry about. Group them into buckets. Bucket A is we comply. This is no problem. We're already doing this. Bucket B is we do not comply, and we're going to have to do something about that. And bucket C is we're not really sure whether we comply or not. Then review the do not comply category and group them. Sometimes it's obvious, right, what you're going to do, and sometimes and it's easy. Sometimes it's obvious, but it's not easy, and sometimes you're not sure what to do. So kind of group the do not comply categories into things, and then get help for things that are hard, for things where you're not sure what to do, for things that are going to take effort that you don't have the wherewithal in-house. All right, so that's the strategy for gap analysis. The other strategy, of course, is to just outsource it, right? Have someone come in and do it for you. We provide that service. For example, you can have us do your gap analysis. All right, so next, self-assessment questionnaires. They come in 4 flavors, as I mentioned, A, B, C, D. Each letter contains everything from the previous letter, so they kind of escalate as they go along. So D contains C, C contains B, B contains A. So you would really like to be as early in the alphabet as you can, because early is easier, later is harder. And the big difference is between C and D, and that has to do with whether you store payment card data. So if you store payment card data, then you have to deal with requirement 10, the tracking and monitoring of access to payment card data, and that's a huge pain. And like I said before, any amount of storing counts. So if you can think of a way to not store payment card data, that's probably quite advantageous. All right, so can you stop storing data? Next, let's talk about a couple of pitfalls that we often see as folks are working through the process. The first is, as I mentioned before, failure to involve the business. It's their fault we're in this mess, right? They're the ones who decided we needed to take payment cards in the first place. And they can do some things that IT can't, and they know some things that IT doesn't, and they're going to have to live with what IT does. So get them involved from the beginning and make sure they know that this is, they're in this fight too. This is partly theirs. Failure to control scope, either assuming that the whole environment must be PCI compliant and not even thinking about scope, or doing a poor job of isolating the cardholder data environment. Seriously, this is the big ticket item from this presentation. So if you only think of one thing after this, it's like get a handle on scope. Waiting until the last minute is another common pitfall. Probably you've gotten the idea from all of my ranting about scope that compliance might demand some major surgery on the environment, and so waiting till the last minute is going to make that harder. And then unintentionally not knowing that you have incurred obligations. Do you have a payment application that you sell and license to others? Or like, are you a franchisor who sells and licenses software to franchisees? You might have PCI DSS problems. Do you handle payment card data for somebody else? Like, do you operate a call center that takes payments for other people? Well, now you're a service provider, and there's stuff that comes along with that. That's beyond the scope of this presentation, but just be advised that there can be some pitfalls like that. There are a couple of environments that are traditionally challenging. Call centers are really hard because you've got shared systems, right? Different people using cubicles at different times of day. Staff comes and goes. They're usually a service provider if they're handling calls for third parties. They've got problems with call recording for quality assurance, but a payment card number might get recorded, or IVR apps where people can type in their payment card numbers. Call centers are a tricky business for PCI. Also on the tricky side, universities. There's often multiple merchants on campus, athletic ticketing, the bursar's office, the bookstore, cafeterias, goodness knows what else. And they might have, each kind of has its own maybe IT, so that can be hard. Distributed retail networks, if you have a nationwide chain of stores, you might have multiple different cardholder data environments, and maintaining control over those otherwise autonomous sites can be hard. Custom-built applications. Many developers who are making e-commerce websites are really unaware of the PCI requirements for custom software, or people who are integrating payment card data into their core business systems like SAP or whatever their CRM is. That can make life pretty challenging also. All right, so a quick footnote on scanning. We've mentioned scanning a couple of times. It's not enough merely to do scans. You need to have passing scans. So when you do a scan, each system that gets scanned is graded as either a pass or a fail. And if you have a fail, you have to fix all those failures and then rescan them until you pass. If you've never read a scan report before, this can be tricky. Sometimes scanning vendors are just kind of an automated portal. You sign up with them, you schedule your scan, you download the results, and then it's up to you to figure out what to do, and it's difficult to get extra help. So when you're picking a scanning vendor, that's something to think about. How much hand-holding do you want to have? And basically, it's a trade-off of price versus service. So for example, we're very expensive as approved scanning vendors go, but we have experienced folks who will be on the phone with you to answer questions, and we stand by that, and we'll work through the problems with you. If, on the other hand, you are experienced with PCI, you know which end of the scan report is up, really you don't need a service as sort of touchy-feely as ours, and you should just maybe find the cheapest one you can. So there are different scanning vendors. They're not all the same. So what should we do if we're not compliant? What happens to us? Well, a couple of things could happen. Your bank could start charging you a different rate per transaction. They might fine you. Sometimes the fine is very small. I've seen banks charge fines for as little as $25 per quarter, and I've had customers say, okay, bill us. We can live with that. And then I've seen Amex levy fines that are very large, $75K and up. And then if you have a security incident that involves payment card data, that's when things get really bad. You'll get fines. You might get told you have to use a QSA going forward. You'll get fees that are associated with recovery from the breach. You might get sued. That can be a real mess. All right, so what can CDW help with? We do gap analysis, as I mentioned before. You've probably heard that we sell stuff also. You can buy things from us that can help you with PCI.
I do?
Yeah, I know. It's a secret for most people, but you can buy stuff from us, it turns out. We have engineering services if you need help redesigning your network, etc. And, of course, we can do that scanning. We can do penetration testing. We can do code review if you need it. So pretty much anything you might want on the PCI front, we can help with. All right, one footnote. We are not a QSA at the moment. So if you need an official report on compliance, we can't do that for you, so alas. And then the other thing we won't do is we won't author policies for you. We think that's a bad idea to hire someone else to do that. We can point you towards some templates. We can provide guidance about the policies. We can review your policies, but we don't want to write them for you. We just think that's something organizations should do for themselves. All right, into the home stretch here. I'm going to make a bunch of false statements now. So this is, do not believe anything you see on this slide. First off, there's this myth that at any moment in the dead of night, the PCI auditors might knock on the door and we'd get yelled at. There are no PCI auditors. That's good news, right? The PCI Security Standards Council is really just like a dozen people. They're not patrolling the nation looking for delinquents. The bad news is you're responsible for policing your own compliance. So you've got to take the initiative to get that done, and no one's going to come out there and kind of coach you along. Next myth, I've mentioned this before, PCI is IT's responsibility. It's the whole business. The next one would be, I need a QSA to do my penetration testing. A lot of people will have to do not just quarterly scans, but also annual penetration tests. There's this sort of myth that I often encounter that you have to be a QSA to do that. You don't. Anyone with the skills can do penetration testing. Likewise, a corresponding myth, I need an approved scanning vendor to do my internal scans. No. The only thing you need an approved scanning vendor for is the external scans. For most organizations, for internal scanning, the best thing to do is to just acquire your own scanning solution, so buy a scanner. Same thing for wireless testing, by the way. It just becomes cost ineffective if you're having a third party do that for you all the time. Another myth is we can do all of this ourselves. You can do almost all of it yourselves. You're only really required to use a third party for the external scans unless you also have to have a QSA. But very few shops have all of the skills that they need in-house. So don't be afraid to ask for help as you're going along. So a couple of slides here of just helpful things. This is for review later. This is the acronym soup here. I've defined all of these terms as we've gone along, but for those of you who are downloading the presentation, this is a helpful slide for you later. Same with this one, a couple of useful URLs. PCISecurityStandards.org, that is the Council's website. That's where the actual official document is. CDW maintains a nice library of compliance documents. Some of those might be helpful. There's a document called the Principles of PCI Compliance, which I think is one of the assets that's included for download with this presentation. That's a nice, helpful document. And maybe a little bit more lively reading than things you might get from the PCI Security Standards Council. So a couple of closing thoughts, and then we'll do our Q&A. You're going to have to comply if you deal with payment cards at all. And there's no such thing as almost compliant or mostly compliant. It's binary. You either comply or you don't comply. So there's no credit given for good intentions. If you know you're not compliant now, but you have an action plan, you're still not compliant. Compliance can be complex. As we've seen, there's lots of acronyms, plenty of documents, lots of different objectives to deal with. It is a game of details. Don't trust off-the-cuff guidance. Don't trust someone who gives you a glib answer. Answering a hard question demands that they come and look at your environment and spend some time with you and understand the details of the situation. Again, control scope, involve the business, have an organized plan, and you're going to be okay. And then lastly, you're not alone. There's help available at every step of this process. All right. So those are my sort of morals from this. And now we have reached the Q&A portion of the afternoon. So Mike, you want to step up and give me some questions?
Absolutely, Peyton. And I must say I'm impressed. I didn't think you were going to get through all of that in 48 minutes. And only because there's so much great content. So I really want to thank you for that. And as I mentioned, we have a lot of questions in the queue, but keep them coming. We'll get to as many of them as we can. The ones we do not have time for will receive a response after the event. This one from Steve, who says, we're being notified from a particular credit card, let's not name names.
Who shall be nameless, right?
And a particular bank, who will also be nameless, of a pending PCI audit. Would becoming PCI compliant with this one credit card and bank be sufficient for all others? Can we flash our PCI card once and we're done?
Yeah, basically, yeah. That's the whole idea of the PCI DSS, is that it is one size fits all. Now, there might be some weird exceptions, and again, it's a game of details. So if you've got specific agreements with different card brands, that might be a different matter. Mm-hmm. But for most people, yeah, PCI compliance is PCI compliance, and that was the whole point of implementing it. So we didn't have different standards for every single card brand.
Okay, terrific. Thank you for that. So you can go, whew, and you're done with that. This one from Clifton, who says, what about email systems? We have clients who sometimes send credit card information to us this way. We wish they didn't, but they do.
Yeah. So what you really want is to keep your email system out of scope.
Okay.
And so having payment card data in there will put it in scope. So what you want to try to do is think of ways to prevent that. So one measure, and this is not the only possible workaround, but one thing that I've seen a university do is if they get an email, and so they're concerned not just with payment cards but also social security numbers. They have an automated system which, if an email comes, it sits in front of their actual email server. And if an email comes, it inspects it for either payment card data or social security numbers. If it sees anything in there, it just writes a note back and says, I'm sorry, you've included some information here that we can't accept via email. Please call us or follow one of these processes to submit that data. We cannot accept your email. And that keeps their email system out of scope. There are probably other ways around it, and it's going to depend a little bit. The right answer for you is going to depend a little bit on what kind of customers you're dealing with and how much of this happens and so forth. But yeah, you don't want them sending payment card data to you. It's a little bit of a gray area because this isn't a process you're trying to initiate, but once payment card data is in there, that's a potential source of real trouble.
Okay, so can we travel back into the past to make that not happen? Curious whether we got some kind of time travel for us to solve that one. Keep the questions coming. This one from Indra, who asks, in considering vendor or third-party contracts, how can an organization best ascertain PCI DSS compliance and quality assurance or quality controls?
So usually you should just be able to ask. So if you're thinking of hosting, say, your website in some third-party data center, you want to see that they're certified as a service provider. And they should just be able to tell you that. For service providers, you can probably see them listed at the PCI Security Standards website. Same thing for QSAs and approved scanning vendors, ASVs. The PCI Security Standards Council keeps track of all of those, so you can see if those folks are certified. If you're just doing business with someone and you want to know if they're PCI compliant, like let's say you want to deal with someone else, you want them to take care of your payment card transactions for you or something like that, I would just ask them to show you evidence of their compliance. They should be able to prove to you that they are. Okay,
great. Good. Thanks for that. Keep the questions coming, folks. We still have about 8 minutes. We can try and squeeze in as many as we can, but we can't if we don't have it, so send it in. This one also from Kevin, who says, what constitutes unique IDs for those who need to ascertain cardholder data, and is that regulated?
So a unique ID is an ID that is not like any other ID, right? Usually what we're talking about here is a user ID on a system. So a username. So everybody has their own username. Basically, IDs are not being shared between multiple individuals. That's what that really means.
Okay. Got it. So it could be an email address or something like that.
Yeah, like I said, usually it's a login and password. And so what you don't want is everybody logs in as, sales. You want salesperson A, salesperson B, salesperson C, so that you can tie a transaction or a given access of payment card data back to an individual, not back to a shared account.
Okay, terrific. Thanks for that. Another one from Indra, who asks, what have been or what are the associated costs in maintaining PCI compliance? Could you provide an example of both compliance and non-compliance to include any impacts, like public relations and the like?
Yeah, there's a little bit of a teaser in the intro or in the ad for this seminar that sort of talks about in the abstract that talks about how much more expensive it can be to be non-compliant than to be compliant.
Right.
And that's based on a study which is actually in the PCI white paper that I referenced that you can either get from the CDW website or download alongside this presentation. There's a little more detail on that. It's a little bit tricky to say because what counts as, what it costs to become compliant can vary just widely depending on depending on what an organization is doing with payment card data and how complex and large they are. For some people, compliance is really quick and easy. I mean, it's a matter of a few hours' work, filling out some paperwork. For some people, it's a year-long project. Generally speaking, your first time through PCI is the expensive time, and then after that, it's just sort of minor maintenance going forward. And it's the first pass through that is the hard one. I can say that much. But as for concrete data on how much it costs, very hard to pin that down.
Okay, thanks for that. Keep them coming. Another one from Clifton who goes, scanning? What kind of scanning? What are they scanning for?
Great question. What we mostly are talking about is the quarterly external scans, and what this is using a vulnerability scanner to look at your public IP addresses and test them for a database of maybe 10,000 or 20,000 different known potential weaknesses that they might have. So there's a list of kinds of flaws, whether it's like missing patches or weak configurations or errors that need to be tested for. And an approved scanning vendor is someone who has passed the test verifying that their testing regime actually does cover all of those things.
Okay, terrific. This another one from Indra, and thanks for submitting all of them, who asks, is there an entity or a resource that provides some type of ratings with regard to compromise?
I'm not quite sure what that means.
Maybe you meant compliance there, Indra. If you did, go ahead and send a clarification. Let's move on to a next question from Clifton, who says, how do you deal with legacy data? We have scanned forms, speaking of scanning in a different manner, that credit card information has been written on. These are now in a database, and do we have to remediate or remove that credit card information?
Well, for now, that is in scope. Now, the nice thing about this is that information has a lifetime, right? Credit cards expire. And so if your legacy data is more than about 5 years old, chances are you can't really be using it anyway. So what I would do is try to design a process for bundling it up and getting it out of the live database. Write it to an encrypted backup tape, make a couple copies of that, and store one in a safe in New Jersey and one in a safe in California, and you're probably done. The scanned-in data is payment card data, so that would put that database in scope right now. And what you want to do is kind of try to think of ways of weaning off of that is the strategy, I would call it.
Okay, terrific. Here's a great question from Lauren, who asks, from a scope perspective, if a web app server that processes the card data is a member of an Active Directory domain, which it probably is, would all other systems that are also members of that domain be in scope?
Okay. So I'm going to dodge this one a little bit, but I'm going to praise it as being a beautiful example of a hard question, and one you should never trust anyone on a webinar who tries to answer this question. This is an exact example of something that is really detail-oriented. So generally, the sort of off-the-cuff answer, yeah, that sounds like the Active Directory might be in scope, and that's scary. But you might be able to find a way around that with, say, a read-only domain controller, RODC, in the DMZ with that. There might be ways to get the rest of the Active Directory out of scope. The canonical approach, I think, would be to have a forest that has both your internal Active Directory and then something that's dedicated to the payment card environment. But again, this is a really tricky question of Active Directory design and also how you're using the payment card data. And so that's one that demands some study. It's not a quick and easy answer.
Great, and thanks for that, Peyton. That was definitely the answer of a lawyer. We appreciate it. We're just about out of time. I'll try and squeeze in one or two more. This one from Fred, who says, what do you do with your SAC when it's complete? Do you send it to your bank, to the SEC? Should you send it even if it hasn't been requested?
So first off, if someone isn't asking for it, by no means should you send it unsolicited. This is something that you probably only want to send when you are asked for it. And probably only slightly before the deadline on which it is asked for, so that you have the maximum amount of time to take steps and make things easy. Generally, yes, you would be sending this to the bank. The PCI Security Standards Council never heard of you and doesn't want to hear of you. The card brands, there are some folks who would have to send it to a card brand, but generally speaking, it's going to be to your bank. Right. What you'll do is you'll get a letter that says, dear merchant, please be compliant by this date, prove to us that you are. And what that means is on this date, we want to be in receipt of an SAQ that you filled out with all of the boxes marked yes, and then a passing or up to 4 quarterly passing scan reports. And that's who you would send it to, is generally your bank.
Well, it's amazing how the time flies by, and yet you've done it. You spent an entire hour listening to us talk. Peyton, I want to thank you for this fantastic presentation. If you haven't yet done so, you can download a copy of today's deck. And if you joined us late or you'd like to share this with a colleague, well, we have recorded this, and a recorded version will be available within 24 hours. You can surf over to www.eseminarslive.com to view that recording. And while you're there, take a look at our list of upcoming events as well. Once again, my thanks to CDW and McAfee for making today's event possible. For Michael Krieger, that's me. Have a great day.